Have you ever felt the hairs on your neck stand up in the dead of night, as if someone or something was watching you from the shadows? My name is Alaric Varro, and I thought I understood fear. As a photographer of abandoned places, I've walked through halls where the air felt heavy with history, taken steps in ruins that whispered forgotten stories, and stood in rooms where time seemed to stop. But nothing could prepare me for what I'm about to share. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. It began with a dream, but not the kind you wake from in relief. This dream was different. It clung to me, seeped into my waking life like ink spreading through water. What I saw, what I felt, it was so real, so vivid, that I couldn't shake the sensation even after I opened my eyes. I didn't just wake up sweating, I woke up changed. And I knew deep down that the dream was only the beginning. Before I take you deeper into this nightmare, I have to ask, are you ready to face the unknown? Here on Nightmare Chronicles, we don't just recount tales of terror, we bring them to life. But remember, curiosity comes with a cost. If you're brave enough to follow me into the shadows, hit the subscribe button and like this video. Every story is a key to a door you've never opened before. And trust me, you don't want to miss what lies behind them. Activate the notification bell now and join our community of explorers who dare to face the unimaginable. But be warned, once you start walking with the shadows, they might start walking with you. As I prepared to dive into the details of this haunting, I couldn't help but notice the dim glow of my desk lamp flicker. Once, twice, and then steady itself. A chill ran down my spine, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my room, just beyond the reach of the light. Shaking it off, I turned back to my screen, ready to share this story with you. But even as I sit here narrating, the weight of that dream presses on me. I feel it now, the lingering presence, the sense of being watched. And I can't help but wonder, is it still with me? Or has it found you too? Let's step into the nightmare together. But remember, once the story begins, there's no turning back. It began on an unremarkable night, one where the silence seemed heavier than usual, pressing against the walls of my room. Sleep claimed me slowly, yet when it did, it felt like being pulled into a void. The dream transported me to a desolate, labyrinthine alleyway shrouded in darkness. The buildings on either side loomed oppressively, their windows shattered and their walls crawling with ivy that twisted and pulsated as if alive. The air was thick with a suffocating scent of wet stone and decay, wrapping itself around me like a damp shroud. Every breath felt labored, like inhaling the weight of centuries. As I continued walking, I became aware of something watching me. It wasn't a passing feeling. It was a certainty, a weight that settled on my chest. My eyes darted to every dark corner, every flicker of movement, but I saw nothing. And yet I could feel it, a presence just out of sight, following me, studying me. My steps quickened, but the oppressive air made it impossible to move faster than a sluggish shuffle. Then in the distance I saw it, a faint, flickering light emanating from an open doorway. It was the only sign of life in the oppressive void around me. The light pulsed like a dying heartbeat, drawing me toward it. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I moved closer. As I approached, the tapping stopped abruptly, plunging the alleyway into an unbearable silence. Standing before the door, I hesitated. The frame was warped, its wood splintered and scarred with deep gouges that resembled claw marks. The light inside flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows that danced like twisted figures on the walls. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open, and the stench of decay and mildew hit me like a physical blow. Inside, the room was barren, its walls covered in peeling, damp wallpaper that seemed to pulse in time with the light. At its center stood a solitary object, a chair, ancient and rotting, with ropes hanging loosely from its arms as if it had once restrained something or someone. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, and the whispers returned, louder now, their malevolent tones swirling around me like a cyclone. I turned to leave, but the shadows in the room began to shift, gathering in one corner. Slowly, they coalesced into a form, a figure hunched and cloaked in darkness, its edges shimmering like heat waves. Though I couldn't see its face, I knew it was looking at me, watching, waiting. And in that moment, I realized the truth. This wasn't just a dream. It was an invitation, or perhaps a trap. As I stood frozen in the dimly lit room, the figure in the corner remained still, an ominous presence that seemed to consume all light around it. My breathing grew shallow as the temperature plummeted, and frost began to spread across the damp floor beneath me. The whispers that had filled the air moments ago faded into an eerie silence, amplifying the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The chair at the room's center creaked, its decayed ropes swaying gently as if stirred by an unseen force. I tried to move, to step back toward the door, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The shadowy figure shifted slightly, the movement almost imperceptible, yet enough to send a jolt of terror coursing through me. It didn't approach, it didn't need to. Its very presence pressed down on me, a suffocating weight that made the air feel like molasses. As my eyes adjusted to the faint flickering light, I began to notice things I hadn't before. The walls weren't just damp, they were marked with symbols etched deep into the plaster, their jagged lines glowing faintly with an unnatural red hue. They weren't random, they formed patterns, sigils, something ritualistic and ancient. My gaze was drawn to one in particular, a twisted spiral that seemed to pulse in time with the faint light. I didn't understand its meaning, but it filled me with an inexplicable dread, as if it were alive and watching me in return. A sudden noise shattered the oppressive silence, a loud thud from behind me, followed by a scraping sound that echoed through the room. I spun around, my heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Yet, the door I had entered through was now ajar, revealing not the alleyway I had come from, but a long, narrow hallway stretching into darkness. The walls of the hallway were lined with mirrors, each one fractured, their broken shards reflecting distorted fragments of the room I stood in. A faint glow emanated from the far end of the hallway, drawing me forward despite every fiber of my being screaming to stay put. My feet moved on their own, carrying me into the corridor. As I passed each mirror, I caught glimpses of myself, but it wasn't me. My reflections were wrong. In one, my face was blurred as if erased. In another, my eyes were hollow voids, staring back at me with an otherworldly emptiness. And in the final mirror before I reached the end of the hallway, my reflection didn't move. It stood still, its lips curling into a sinister smile as I walked past. The hallway opened into another room, identical to the one I had just left, or so it seemed at first glance. The chair was there, the ropes still swaying, but now the air felt heavier, the darkness more oppressive. And then I noticed the shadows again. This time, they weren't confined to the corners. They moved freely now, slithering across the walls and floor like living things. One of them brushed against my leg, sending a wave of icy cold through my body. In the center of the room, just beside the chair, lay an object I hadn't noticed before, a small, intricately carved box. Its surface was covered in the same glowing sigils that adorned the walls, and it pulsed faintly as if alive. Compelled by a force I couldn't resist, I knelt to examine it. The moment my fingers touched its surface, a searing pain shot through my hand, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. The shadowy figure appeared again, this time standing directly behind the chair. Its form was more distinct now, though its face remained obscured. The air around it shimmered with a malevolent energy, and I could feel its gaze piercing through me. My body trembled as I tried to stand, but the box in my hands seemed to anchor me to the floor. The whispers swirled into coherent words, a voice that echoed in my mind rather than my ears. You've been chosen. The door is open, and there is no turning back. The figure stepped forward, and for the first time, I saw its face, or rather, the absence of one. Its features were an endless void, a blackness so complete it seemed to pull the light from the room. As it reached toward me, the sigils on the box flared brightly, and a deafening roar filled the air. The next thing I knew, I was back in my room, gasping for breath, the box still clutched in my trembling hands. The nightmare had ended, or so I thought, but the shadows in my room felt darker than they should, and from the corner of my eye, I could swear I saw something move. I wasn't alone anymore, and deep down, I knew that the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The room began to collapse in on itself, or at least that's what it felt like. The air grew impossibly dense, pressing against my chest as if the walls themselves were breathing. The shadows thickened, no longer content to remain on the periphery. They swirled around the room like a living storm, coiling and uncoiling, their forms shapeless yet purposeful. My legs refused to move, as though the ground beneath me had turned to tar, rooting me in place. In the center of the chaos, the chair stood unwavering, as though it were an anchor to this otherworldly nightmare. And then I saw it. The box, still in my trembling hands, began to glow brighter, its pulsating sigils now a blinding crimson. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their once fragmented murmurs forming coherent words. Open it. Open the door. My hands moved against my will, prying the lid open with a slow, dreadful inevitability. The moment the box was fully open, the shadows surged toward it, funneling into its hollow interior with an ear-splitting roar. For a brief, blinding moment, the room was illuminated by a light so intense it felt like it would peel away my very skin. And then everything went dark. When my vision returned, I wasn't in the room anymore. I was standing in a vast, endless expanse of darkness, a void so complete that it felt as though reality itself had been erased. The only thing grounding me was the chair, now impossibly far in the distance, a lone object in the sea of black. And standing beside it was the figure, the shadow walker. It was no longer just a blur of darkness. Its form had solidified, towering and grotesque, its limbs unnaturally elongated, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a swirling void, a vortex of emptiness that seemed to draw in everything around it. As it stepped closer, the sound of its movements filled the space, a low, grating noise like stone dragging against stone. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat tightened as though invisible hands were choking the air from my lungs. The box in my hands began to tremble violently, its sigils now burning with an intensity that felt like fire against my skin. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping into a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate and malevolent than the last. "Choose," the shadow walker said, its voice reverberating inside my head, a guttural, otherworldly sound that defied comprehension. "You've opened the door. Now you must decide. Stay or let it in." I didn't understand the choice, but I could feel the weight of it crushing me. The box in my hands began to shift, transforming into something else entirely, a key cold and jagged, humming with an unnatural energy. The shadow walker extended one impossibly long arm, its claw-like hand gesturing toward the chair. My instincts screamed at me to destroy the key, to throw it into the void and end this nightmare. But something deep within me whispered otherwise. As I hesitated, the void around me began to shift. Shapes emerged in the darkness, twisted, ghastly figures with hollow eyes and mouths frozen in silent screams. They reached for me, their translucent hands passing through my body like icy daggers. I could feel their pain, their fear, their endless torment. "Time is running out," the shadow walker growled, its form growing larger, more oppressive as it loomed over me. The key in my hand burned hotter, its jagged edges biting into my skin as though alive. Summoning every ounce of strength, I made my choice. As the key left my hand, the void erupted in a blinding flash of light, and the shadow walker let out a deafening roar that shook the very fabric of the space. The next thing I knew, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. But something was wrong. My room felt different, colder, darker. The shadows in the corners seemed to writhe, almost imperceptibly. And then I saw it. The box, sitting on my desk, its sigils glowing faintly in the dim light. The whispers were gone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I wasn't free. I had opened the door, and I knew, deep in my soul, that something had come through. The morning after the dream, I woke with a start, my heart pounding and my body drenched in cold sweat. Sunlight streamed weakly through my window, yet the room felt darker than it should, as though the shadows had taken on a life of their own. My first thought was relief. It had to have been a nightmare, just a figment of my imagination. But then I saw it, the box. It was there, sitting on my desk where no box had been before. Its surface was exactly as I remembered, etched with glowing, pulsating sigils that seemed to whisper inaudible words in the stillness of the room. My hands trembled as I reached for it, half expecting it to vanish, to prove that my mind was playing tricks on me. But it was real, solid, cold, and impossibly heavy for its size. A faint hum emanated from within, a sound that vibrated in my bones, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, maybe even a prank, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't just a box. It was a part of the nightmare I had somehow carried back with me. My instincts screamed at me to destroy it, to burn it, throw it into the deepest river I could find. But something about it compelled me to hold on, as if letting it go would only make things worse. The unease followed me throughout the day, clinging to me like a shadow I couldn't escape. Even in the brightest rooms, I felt the sensation of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking my every move. It wasn't just paranoia. The whispers returned, faint and fleeting, brushing against the edge of my hearing like ghostly fingers. Driven by an insatiable need for answers, I began researching the symbols carved into the box. Hours turned into days as I scoured obscure forums, ancient texts, and forgotten folklore. What I uncovered made my blood run cold. The symbols weren't random. They belonged to a series of sigils known as keys to the void, markings said to open doorways to dimensions beyond human comprehension. Each symbol was tied to a legend of malevolent entities, shadowy figures that crossed into our world through dreams. One name appeared repeatedly in my search, the Shadow Walker. The legends described a figure that existed on the periphery of perception, a creature that could only be seen when it chose to reveal itself. It was said to haunt those who had opened the door, marking them as its chosen prey. The accounts were horrifying, people driven mad by its presence, their lives unraveling as they were hunted by something that thrived on fear and despair. Many of the stories ended with the same chilling detail. The victims always vanished, leaving nothing behind but faint scorch marks in the shape of its sigil. What terrified me most was the consistency. The locations described in these accounts matched the place I had seen in my dream. The decayed alleyway, the ominous chair, even the distorted mirrors. It wasn't just folklore, it was real. And somehow, I had stumbled into its domain. My search led me to a small online community of self-proclaimed witnesses who shared eerily similar experiences. One message in particular stood out, posted by someone calling themselves the Last Dreamer. The post read, "If you've seen the Shadow Walker, it's already too late. The box is your tether, your bond to the void. You must never open it again. It's watching you now, waiting for you to slip. Whatever you do, don't fall asleep in the dark. It's there, in the corner of the room, just outside the reach of the light." My blood ran cold as I read the words, my eyes darting to the corners of my room, where the shadows seemed to shift imperceptibly. It wasn't just in my head. The figure I had seen, the presence I had felt, it was here, lingering just out of sight. Unable to resist the pull of my curiosity, I reached out to the locals who lived near the alleyway I had dreamed of. Their reactions were almost uniform: fear, avoidance, and hurried excuses to end the conversation. But one old man finally broke his silence after I mentioned the sigils. His voice trembled as he told me about the disappearances, the strange lights that appeared at night, and the whispers that echoed through the abandoned streets. "The Shadow Walker doesn't just haunt dreams," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feeds on them. On you. Once it marks you, there's no escape." As I hung up the phone, a sinking realization settled in my chest. The dream wasn't just a warning. It was a prelude to something far worse. The Shadow Walker had chosen me, and the nightmare was far from over. It had only just begun. Compelled by a gnawing need for answers, I found myself standing at the entrance to the alleyway from my dream. The real-world version was no less unsettling. Crumbling buildings lined the narrow passage, their windows dark and hollow, like the empty eyes of long-forgotten corpses. The air carried the same damp, suffocating scent from my nightmare, laced with something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. My footsteps echoed ominously as I stepped forward, each sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. The deeper I ventured, the more the world seemed to shift. The light dimmed unnaturally, as though the sky itself recoiled from this place. The shadows grew longer, stretching toward me like grasping fingers. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn back, but something stronger, a pull I couldn't explain, drove me forward. About halfway down the alley, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping echoing faintly ahead. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same sound from my dream, and now, in the waking world, it carried a weight that made my skin crawl. The tapping grew louder as I approached, until I realized it wasn't coming from ahead, but above. Slowly, I tilted my head upward, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. There, perched on the edge of a rooftop, was a shadowy figure. Its form was indistinct, flickering like a mirage, but its presence was undeniable. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me, cold and unrelenting. I stood frozen, unable to look away, until a sudden gust of wind swept through the alley, breaking the spell. When I glanced back, the figure was gone. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my camera, snapping photos of the empty rooftop, the walls, the ground, anything that might capture what I had just seen. As I lowered the camera, I noticed something carved into the brickwork nearby, one of the sigils from the box. The lines glowed faintly, as though imbued with a life of their own, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. Further down the alley, I encountered an old woman sitting on a stoop, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. She didn't look at me as I approached, but her raspy voice cut through the silence. "You shouldn't be here," she said without turning. "It sees you now." Before I could respond, she lifted a hand and pointed to a nearby doorway. It was the same one from my dream, its frame splintered and warped, with that faint, pulsing light emanating from within. "That's where it started," she muttered. "And that's where it'll end." For you, at least." The woman's words sent a chill down my spine, but when I turned to ask her what she meant, she was gone, vanished as if she had never been there. The stoop where she had sat was empty, save for a faint trace of frost that melted away under my gaze. Steeling myself, I pushed open the warped door. The stench of decay hit me instantly, thick and overpowering. The interior was exactly as I had seen it in my dream. The peeling wallpaper, the solitary chair, and the faint, rhythmic tapping echoing somewhere unseen. But this time, there was something else, a faint whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, growing louder with every step I took. As I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound reverberating like a thunderclap. Panic surged through me as I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers intensified, their tones mocking and accusatory, as if they knew every secret I had ever buried. In the center of the room, the chair creaked, its ropes swaying as though stirred by an invisible hand. The shadows began to gather, coalescing into shapes that writhed and twisted unnaturally. My camera buzzed faintly in my hand, and I raised it instinctively, snapping a photo. The flash illuminated the room for a split second, and in that brief moment, I saw them, faces in the shadows. They were twisted and grotesque, their hollow eyes filled with rage and despair. Their mouths moved soundlessly, screaming words I couldn't hear but could feel in my chest like a pounding drumbeat. The chair began to move, sliding across the floor toward me, its ropes tightening as though binding something unseen. Before I could react, a voice cut through the chaos, a low, gravelly tone that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. "You shouldn't have come back." I spun around and saw him, a man standing in the doorway that hadn't been there moments before. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his clothes were ragged, hanging loosely from his gaunt frame. He introduced himself as Elias, a local who had encountered the Shadow Walker years ago. He had survived, but barely, and only by surrendering something he refused to name. Elias told me of others who had been drawn here, lured by dreams and visions, only to vanish without a trace. "You're marked now," he said grimly, his gaze flickering to the box in my hand. "That thing isn't just a relic, it's an invitation. And once you accept it, there's no going back." The shadows began to close in, and Elias grabbed my arm. "If you want to live," he whispered, "you'll follow me. But know this, whatever you think you've seen so far is nothing compared to what's coming." As we fled the room, the whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the last thing I saw before the door slammed shut behind us was the chair, now surrounded by writhing shadows that seemed to reach for me, hungry and relentless. And for the first time, I realized the truth. This wasn't just about me. The Shadow Walker wasn't just watching, it was waiting. For what? I didn't yet know. But I feared the answer was closer than I dared imagine. The shadows were alive. They twisted and writhed, coiling like serpents along the walls and ceiling of the narrow corridor Elias and I had entered. The air was thick, almost unbreathable, and carried a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. Every step echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back distorted, as if the space itself was mocking our presence. Elias moved ahead, his flashlight flickering erratically, casting fleeting beams of light that only made the darkness feel deeper. At the end of the hallway, there was a door, an ancient thing, warped and splintered, with the same sigils from the box carved deeply into its surface. These symbols pulsed faintly, their glow resembling dying embers, and the closer we got, the louder the whispers became. They weren't just background noise anymore. They were clear, distinct voices calling my name. Elias stopped abruptly, his breathing heavy, and turned to face me. "This is it," he said, his voice trembling. "Whatever you're looking for, it's behind that door. But I'll warn you, once you open it, you'll never leave the same." His eyes were hollow, a haunted look etched into his face that spoke of things too horrific to describe. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped forward. My hand trembled as I reached for the door's rusted handle, the metal icy against my skin. As I pushed it open, a low, guttural groan reverberated through the hallway, as though the building itself was crying out in protest. The room beyond was vast, impossibly larger than the exterior suggested. Its walls were lined with mirrors, cracked and splintered, their surfaces reflecting not me, but distorted images of shadowy figures. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and atop it lay an object that stopped me in my tracks, an old, leather-bound journal. The air grew heavier as I approached, the whispers crescendoing into a cacophony of overlapping voices. My heart raced as I reached for the journal, its cover adorned with the same spiral sigil that had haunted me since the dream. The moment my fingers touched it, a searing pain shot through my hand, and the room plunged into complete darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the void, came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. They echoed unnaturally, each step sending vibrations through the ground and through my body. I turned, and there it was, the shadow walker, stepping out of the blackness. Its form was no longer indistinct. It stood tall and grotesque, its elongated limbs bent at impossible angles, its movements fluid yet unnatural. Its face, or lack thereof, was a swirling void, an absence that seemed to consume the very fabric of reality around it. As it moved closer, the air grew colder, and my breath crystallized in the dim light. The shadow walker stopped mere feet from me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. It raised one spindly arm, pointing directly at the journal. Its voice, deep and resonant, filled the room, though its void-like face remained motionless. "You've come for answers," it said, the words vibrating in my bones. But answers demand sacrifice. The journal's pages began to turn on their own, revealing entries written in a language I couldn't understand. But one symbol kept appearing. The same sigil from the box, the door, and my dreams. Then the final page stopped, revealing a drawing that made my blood run cold. It was me, standing in this very room, holding the journal. Below it was a single word, choose. The shadow walker moved closer, its elongated limbs folding unnaturally as it loomed over me. Its void-like face tilted, as if studying me waiting. The journal began to glow faintly, and the whispers returned, this time sharper, more demanding. "You have a choice," the shadow walker intoned, its voice cutting through the chaos. "Close the door and forget, or open the way and become what you fear." The room seemed to warp around me, the mirrors reflecting scenes of my life, moments I had buried, memories I had forgotten. And in each reflection, the shadow walker lingered, always in the background, always watching. My hands trembled as I clutched the journal, its weight far heavier than it should have been. Elias's voice cut through the haze, shouting from somewhere behind me. "Don't listen to it. It's trying to trap you." But his words felt distant, drowned out by the whispers and the overwhelming presence of the shadow walker. The sigil on the journal began to burn brighter, its glow filling the room, and I realized the truth. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. The shadow walker wasn't offering me freedom. It was offering me a piece of its reality, a chance to understand the void at the cost of my humanity. My fingers tightened around the journal as I made my choice. The room erupted in blinding light, and the last thing I saw was the shadow walker's face, or rather, the infinite void within it, before everything went silent. When I awoke, I was back in the alleyway, the journal clutched in my hands. The world seemed unchanged, but I wasn't. The shadows around me felt alive, moving just out of sight, and the sigil burned faintly on the journal's cover. The shadow walker had left, but not entirely. It was with me now, a part of me, and I knew that I would never escape its gaze. The question wasn't whether it would return, but when. When I woke up, I was lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by the sterile hum of machines and the cold, clinical light of fluorescence. My body ached, my head throbbed, and my mind raced with fragments of what had just happened. The journal was gone. At least, that's what I thought at first. But as I sat up, I noticed a faint, blackened spiral mark burned into the skin of my palm. The same sigil that had haunted my dreams, the alleyway, and the shadow walker's domain. The doctors told me I'd been found unconscious in the middle of the alley, curled in the fetal position, muttering incoherently. They asked what had happened, but what could I say? That I had crossed into a nightmare that had bled into reality? That I had faced a creature born of shadows, and made a choice that I still didn't fully understand? I was discharged the following day, but the world outside felt different, off. The sunlight was muted, the sounds of the city dulled, as if some invisible filter had been placed over everything. Most unsettling of all was the way the shadows behaved. They no longer stayed where they should. Instead, they seemed to stretch toward me, shifting unnaturally, as though they had a will of their own. Back at home, I found my camera on the desk where I'd left it before venturing into the alley. My hands trembled as I powered it on and scrolled through the photos I'd taken. At first, they seemed normal, grainy shots of the decayed alleyway and its eerie sigils. But then I reached the final images, and my blood ran cold. The last photo showed the shadow walker, standing in the center of the room from my dream. Its form was perfectly captured, the elongated limbs, the void-like face, the oppressive darkness radiating from it. But the detail that froze me in place was its hand, outstretched, pointing directly at the camera, as if it knew I was watching. The whispers began again that night. Faint at first, like the sound of wind brushing against a window, but soon they grew louder, more insistent. They came from every corner of my apartment, filling the air with fragmented words and phrases that I couldn't decipher. I barely slept, my mind racing with questions. What had I unleashed? What had I become? Over the following days, I started noticing the sigil in unexpected places. It appeared in the condensation on my bathroom mirror, etched faintly into the frost on my window, even burned into the wood grain of my desk. No matter how many times I tried to wipe it away, it always returned, as if mocking my attempts to escape. Then came the dreams, or rather, the return of the dreams. Each night, I found myself back in the void, standing before the shadow walker. It didn't speak this time, it didn't need to. Its presence was enough to paralyze me, its void-like face an endless abyss that pulled me deeper with every passing second. Each morning, I woke drenched in sweat, the sigil on my palm burning faintly as though it had been branded anew. One evening, as I sat alone in the dim light of my apartment, a noise broke the silence, a faint tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned toward the window. At first, I saw nothing but the darkness of the night outside. But then I noticed it, a faint outline, just beyond the glass. It wasn't fully visible, but it was there, shifting in the shadows, watching me. I backed away, my pulse racing, but the tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. And then it stopped, replaced by a single, guttural word whispered directly into my ear. Soon. Since that night, I haven't been alone. The shadow walker is always there, lingering just out of reach, a constant presence that I can't escape. The sigil appears more frequently now, not just in my home, but in places I've never been before. It's on the walls of buildings I pass, carved into the pavement of streets, even reflected in the eyes of strangers. And then there's the box. It reappeared on my desk one morning, as though it had always been there. Its sigils glow faintly, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I've tried to get rid of it, burn it, bury it, throw it into the river, but it always returns, a silent reminder of the choice I made and the price I now pay. Now I live in a state of constant dread, waiting for the moment when the shadow walker will step fully into my world. It's no longer a question of if, but when. And the whispers tell me that I won't be the only one it comes for. As you've listened to this story, perhaps you've felt it too. The shift in the air, the subtle movements in the corner of your eye. Maybe you've noticed the shadows growing longer, darker, more alive. If you've made it this far, I have to ask, are you alone right now? Are you sure? Look around carefully. Pay attention to the darkness. And if you see the sigil, or feel the faint, icy breath of something standing behind you, know this, it's already too late. If you've felt a chill, a presence, or even seen the sigil in your own life, let me know in the comments. Your theories, your experiences, they might be the key to understanding this nightmare. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, but be warned. Every new viewer opens another door, and some doors were never meant to be unlocked. We'll meet again in the shadows. Until then, keep the lights on.